This visual essay seeks to understand climate change beyond standalone science to a political issue that manifests in US culture. The essay will be comprised of 3 parts. Part 1 looks at the documentary film examples of The Age of Stupid and When the Levees Broke to provide a way of conceiving an environmental crisis as a political, economic and social crisis. Understanding the climate in this way, Part 2 argues that within the political culture of the climate, institutions such as corporations, the state, and the media have created a pro-oil and Republican narrative to support climate change denial. Part 3 then argues we need a competing political narrative that justifies climate action, looking at Barbara Kingsolver's flight behaviour as a way of starting to think how that would be achieved. We argue that the politics of human actions, rather than actions in themselves, have the greatest impact on the fate of our climate. Contemporary filmmaking on the subject of climate change, including The Age of Stupid, directed by Fanny Armstrong, and When the Levees Broke, directed by Spike Lee, have strongly advocated the idea of it being a human issue and political crisis. The 2 films, however, have fundamentally differing ideas of who is responsible, who is to blame, and who is most at risk when it comes to thinking of climate change politically. In When the Levees Broke, Lee explores Hurricane Katrina and the following crisis through the lens of institutional racism were affected the most and were neglected by the government or emergency agencies, a social driver of the natural disaster. The Age of Stupid, on the other hand, generalises its gaze to humanity as a whole. Blame is not placed on the systematic marginalisation of black and poor communities, but on the overall inability of humanity to acknowledge climate change as a result of human action. In When the Levees Broke, Lee presents a crisis in which an economic, social and political system is responsible. Anna Hartnell, for example, argues that When the Levees Broke points to a complicated web of social, political and environmental blind spots that led to Katrina and its catastrophic aftermath. These truths, which cover just beneath national consciousness, constituted a disaster of racial and economic disenfranchisement that was exposed and further exacerbated by the levee breaches in August 2005. Indeed, Lee focuses on racial and economic disenfranchisement, but rather than a complicated web, the problem that Lee depicts is quite clear. The viewer, for example, is frequently shown stark contrasts. On the one hand, we see rich white Americans evacuating the city with ease. On the other hand, we also see the abandonment of poor black communities, including the displacement of 1.2 million people. Similarly, on the one hand, we are shown images of the poorest areas in which underfunding led to the building of 10-foot levees instead of the recommended 17. On the other hand, we see large funding towards the war on terror and the deployment of the National Guard in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then, we understand the suffering during this time was not the result of a freak accident, but a political choice. But this leads us to think how we might make such a system care. Indeed, Professors Richard Galvin and John Harris argue that climate change is a collective action problem. Collective action problems involve cases in which any single act, taken individually, caused no harm, but numerous acts of that sort produce serious harms. If no one else were driving a car, that action would make no difference. The problem, of course, is that many other millions are driving cars. The cumulative effect is calamitous, the collective action problem. In fact, it's in this film that we find a complicated web in which different clips of everyday actions combined are shown to be the cause of global warming. Not limited to the United States, the film looks globally to a village in Nigeria used by Shell for its oil. In the most oil-rich region in West Africa, it has no clean drinking water, no health service, no secondary school, and no electricity. Out of these multiple experiences, the documentary predicts a future world where we might look back at how we could have saved ourselves, but we didn't. Therefore, unlike the clear depiction of victim and oppressor in When the Levees Broke, then, the blame in The Age of Stupid is far more dispersed. Even the worst victims of climate change hold some level of responsibility. Given what we know from When the Levees Broke, the implications of The Age of Stupid's depiction of the world could be denounced as close to victim blaming. The merits of the film, however, come from highlighting the hypocrisy and contradictions in the politics of climate change. One example is people wanting to tackle climate change but not wanting to have wind farms, claiming they devalue property. Also include a man whose home was affected by Hurricane Katrina, acknowledges that humans are changing the climate, but sees no problem in working at an offshore oil rig in Louisiana for oil corporation Shell. In each case, there is a political rationalization of the contradiction. In highlighting the politics of these contradictions, The Age of Stupid points out that simply knowing about the science of climate change is not enough. Armstrong's film agrees with Lee's that politics affects the way we think and act about climate change just as much as scientific education does. Galvin and Harris's claim then that climate change is simply a collective action problem is inadequate. The problem is in the power of certain politics to rationalise our actions. Lee's When the Levees Broke already alludes to one type of politics, mainly racism, that justifies a lack of climate action. But The Age of Stupid does too. In a short segment, the documentary states that the oil business isn't just in bed with government, it is the government, and questions why were oil company lobbyists allowed to change government reports on global warming, and why was the same PR firm hired to persuade the public that smoking is healthy, then employed by the oil industry to convince us that there is still doubt about climate change? From both films then we get to understand that a range of institutions, including the state, political parties and the media, have created a national political discourse that seeks to raise support for opposition to climate action. In this essay, we will look at how collusion between organisations like American Petroleum Institute, API, the Republican Party and Fox News has led to an anti-climate action and pro-oil political narrative that does not need the support of science. The post-Hurricane Katrina crisis brought to light the inherent inequality in the US state when it came to giving support given to poor black communities. As stated in When the Levees Broke, 25% of all natural gas produced in the United States was being produced offshore in Louisiana, yet the area saw no profit from the extraction of its resources, as all money went to the federal government. As alluded to in The Age of Stupid, the oil business is the government. This inequality is not surprising when we look at who exactly has power in the state. President George Bush comes from the oil business Bush family. President Donald Trump too has business in the oil industry, with investments in the fossil fuel companies Shell, Halliburton, Total and Chevron. Trump has appointed Rick Perry as Energy Secretary, a politician who has denied climate change, called for the abolition of the Department of Energy, and even suggested that renewable energies are destabilizing influences on the nation's electrical grid. One problem that politicians like Bush and Trump have met is a growing acknowledgement that climate change has human causes. As early as 1988, for example, NASA scientist James Hansen testified to the US Congress that he was 99% certain that warmer temperatures were caused by the burning of fossil fuels and not solely a result of natural variation. In order to justify their actions then, denialist politicians require support from news programs such as Fox News. Fox News, for example, combines a Republican agenda with the idea that the greenhouse effect is a myth, a joke, or is part of a conspiracy created by scientists.
New Yale study says 57% of teens understand that global warming is caused mostly by humans' activities. Is it really now?
I don't believe climate change is real. I think this is global warming hysteria and alarmism.
So-called global warming, which isn't happening.
Global warming is illusory. We're actually going through a period of global cooling.
Calling carbon dioxide a pollutant? Come on.
Look how much pollution I just put out.
A lot of it would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous.
This is our Fox News global warming alert for you. It is freezing.
Blizzard versus global warming. Who do you believe, Al Gore or your freezing butt?
A pre-winter into winter storm like Europe hasn't seen in years. Forget about all that global warming talk.
It's not global warming, I'll tell you that.
Another storm could be headed this way next week. Global warming, where are you? We want you back.
Through Fox News then, climate action advocates are delegitimized as either stupid or unpatriotic. At the same time, oil companies have started their own media campaign. In the 1990s, as climate change became recognized as an important issue, industrial organizations like the American Petroleum Institute organized a controversial campaign to confuse the public about the facts of climate science. API continues to use influential propaganda. Recently, they launched a campaign named Power Past Impossible at the 27th Super Bowl, where they informed the ways in which everyone's lives are touched by oil and natural gas. The commercial had two parts. Oil, a modern look at how oil is integrated in products consumers use now and in the future, supported by bold visuals. And natural gas, a dynamic, consumer-centric approach on the positive and surprising ways natural gas adds to the value to our daily lives. As we see, the national advertising campaign was an attempt to highlight how natural gas and oil provide enormous benefits and is backed by a growing grassroots movement of more than 30 million Americans. In fact, the API goes further than Fox News by pointing out that not only is oil our only realistic and safe option, but that it has a positive, almost magical quality. Not only has it been used to ignore climate science, political narrative is also used to ignore or misrepresent victims of environmental issues and their social causes. In particular, When the Levees Broke explores the manipulation of the images of the victims after Katrina, who were given one-way tickets and dispersed among 44 states. On the one hand, Lee combines clips of media outlets referring to displaced residents as refugees.
Thousands of refugees. Refugees. For an untold number of refugees. The refugees. 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 The Astrodome is refugee.
On the other hand, we also see figures such as Barbara Bush, mother of President Bush, stating that victims were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them. The dominant discourse surrounding victims then was either of outsiders needing our help, or people who didn't need help at all, rather than the people living within a discriminatory system. Representation of the experience of victims themselves was denied in mainstream media, allowing only for dissident voices such as Kanye West's.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are black. And even for me to complain about, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've even been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give, and just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well off as slow as possible. I mean, this is Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us.
So, we have seen how climate science denial co-opts fantastical narratives of oil, supported by political party and media institutions. However, climate action advocacy too can claim a positive narrative that goes beyond standalone science. Indeed, to compete with denial, climate action advocacy must identify with a social and human narrative. We find a clear presentation of the importance of political narrative in Joel Pett's satirical comic from 2009, in which a climate action advocate lists all the benefits of his environmental program, including clear air and water, healthier children, and more employment. To which a denier replies, "What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing?" The point here being that even if the science of climate action was wrong, it doesn't matter, because the narrative of a better world according to human need is desirable even to the deniers. Narrative is important for climate action advocacy, but it matters what that narrative is. In contemporary culture, we find multiple narratives in support of climate action, with varying impact. We look at, on the one hand, mainstream Hollywood depictions of the climate that pick up old ideas of punishment and redemption in films like The Day After Tomorrow and 2012. On the other hand, more fringe depictions such as Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behaviour attempt to incorporate both real experiences and ideas of emancipation, which have far greater potential. In the case of the Hollywood depiction then, climate change is often depicted at its end point of Armageddon. The government has collapsed, environmental events have wiped out masses of people, and individuals or families are left to fend for themselves. In A Day After Tomorrow, for example, the US government has fled to Mexico, while Sam Hall must survive a flooded and frozen Manhattan. In The Submerging of Manhattan, The Day After Tomorrow evokes strong biblical images. Indeed, literary theorist K.J. Renner argues modern apocalyptic narratives resemble biblical ones, in that the socially responsible and selfless characters are often depicted as the worthiest survivors. Tying Renner to The Day After Tomorrow, what makes Sam a worthy survivor is his compassion for his peers, but also knowing that humanity was responsible for the catastrophe. The problem with this narrative is that, by focusing on the responsibility of simply people, it ignores the importance of private, state and social institutions. Moreover, by depicting the punishment of humanity by catastrophe, this narrative seeks to advocate climate action through guilt, rather than making a positive case. An approach with more potential is one that incorporates real life experience and relates it with ideas of emancipation. An example of this approach is Kingsolver's flight behaviour. In an interview about flight behaviour, Kingsolver gave the statement,
"Why do we believe or disbelieve the evidence we see for climate change?" And because I live in Southern Appalachia and have great respect for communities of people who have chosen to believe otherwise, I really wanted to look into how we make those choices and how it's possible to begin a conversation across some of these divides between scientists and non-scientists, between rural and urban, between progressive and conservative, that when it comes to understanding the scientific truths about the world, there must be another way to bring information to people that's beyond simply condescending and saying, well, if only you had the facts, if only you knew what I did, then you would be a smart person. That gets you nowhere.
Kingsolver's approach, then, differs from the Hollywood approach in that she focuses on the contemporary human experience rather than the catastrophic end. In the case of Della Robbia, Kingsolver's main character, the human experience involves interpreting the world through the conflicting filters of the church, her rural community, the media, marriage, and scientific institutions. It asks the question, why has a mass of monarch butterflies inhabited her local area? The answer is of course climate change, but by asking the question, she begins to question or challenge the conflicting institutions that surround her. Through understanding the climate, Della Robbia learns that a freer, better life is possible. Therefore, Kingsolver is able to link a story about the climate with a story of emancipation. We return then to Pet's satirical cartoon. The monarch phenomenon in flight behaviour isn't true, it's fiction, though supported by sound scientific theory. Kingsolver's approach of the emancipatory climate narrative, therefore, has far more potential in pointing out the desirability of climate action, rather than simply scaring deniers into accepting it through the threat of apocalypse. In fact, we argue that Kingsolver does not go far enough. As discussed, Lee's When the Levees Broke points out that environmental issues have deep class and racial lines, in terms of the suffering of ordinary people and the influence of the powerful. Kingsolver alludes to these issues, but they could be incorporated even more into the emancipatory climate narrative. Such a narrative would show oil interests and their supporting institutions, such as the API and Fox News, as alien to day-to-day human experience. Della Robbia's search for understanding the world and its potential for emancipation should be expanded and connected with the variety of experiences in the United States and around the world, including those found in When the Levees Broke and Asia Stupid. Such a widespread narrative would be able to compete with the denialist Republican narrative.